Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 286. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on the show for another Iran update this week. There's a lot going on with Iran news and how the negotiations around the nuclear deal are developing. We're getting into, I think, a very dangerous situation here. But before we do that, I have a story on Yemen I would like to cover. So if anybody would like to share the show and all the important news we're covering today, you can find the show at the Libertarian Institute. Audio version of the podcast is anywhere you could listen to podcasts, as well on the Libertarian Institute All podcast feed. Video version of the show at Odyssey, Rumble, and if you really have to, you can subscribe on YouTube. You can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest, and you can donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or in crypto. All that information in the show notes page. Also in the show notes page, you can find all the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE. Paloma Verde is the home to high-quality CBD products, pretty much anything you could want. They have at Paloma Verde. Connor, tell me about what your favorite things are at Paloma Verde.
I strongly recommend the soft gels. I take them after meals, and you'll have any, relief from any kind of inflammation you may have. Help you recover quicker on runs and any kind of exercise. Get you back out there sooner. I also love the gummy bears. Those act instantly, and they're delicious. And the tinctures, I think, are the best bang for your buck. They last a long time, and it seems to be the strongest. I think it is the absolute strongest dose you can get. And also, I really do love those ones that I give to my dog, because they do seem to make her movements a lot smoother and help her with any kind of joint pain she's got. She's about near 10 years old, so it comes in handy quite a bit. So all of that stuff is, I can recommend that very, very strongly.
All right, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE when you check out. That will save you 20%, and it will get the show a kickback. So it's a great way to get yourself some high-quality CBD products and to help out your favorite show. All right, Connor, let's get into it. The first story I have today is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. White House defends Biden's plan to visit pariah Saudi Arabia and meet with Mohammed bin Salman. On Tuesday, the White House defended Biden's plan to meet with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, even though the president has called him a pariah. And so, Connor, this is obviously very problematic for Biden to be going to Saudi Arabia, because he has this campaign and he's trying to divide the world into democracies versus autocracies. And, Putin and China are the bad guys in this, and then democracies are good. Well, one of the least democratic places on the entire planet is Saudi Arabia. And rather than, seeking any way to hold Mohammed bin Salman accountable, even though he's responsible for the dismemberment of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Biden's going to go meet with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, kiss the ring, continuing to provide weapons and everything to the Saudis. And so, obviously, his whole shtick about the world, needing to support democracies and everything really doesn't hold true if you're willing to support one of the most brutal governments. And then we have this report from the New York Times, and I wrote this up for the Libertarian Institute. And Connor, that report details that there's a new Government Accountability Office report on the war in Yemen, and that report details that the U.S. has not been monitoring the civilian casualties in the Yemen war, and they have not been monitoring the use of U.S. weapons by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So this is extremely problematic, Connor, of course, because the U.S. is supposed to be monitoring all of this. The Times reports that multiple sources are concerned that the State Department is essentially going to try to kill or neuter this report before it actually becomes public. They're going to classify portions of the report and obscure, what the public is allowed to see and know about the U.S. war in Yemen. Now, I think finds overall, or at least according to the Washington Post, the report will find that in general, civilian deaths were down in 2021. However, they were starting to uptick at the end of the year, and we had covered on the show how, in general, the war was ramping up around the end of 2021, the beginning of 2022. So my guess is, that this report found that maybe in general during 2021 things were down, but we did have that uptick. But now there has been a ceasefire in Yemen for 2 months, and that has been extended and supposed to last another 2 months. So the fighting in that country seems to be down a little bit. Connor, I'm not sure what. Oh, and then in the past, in the 2020 version of this report, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo classified the findings of the report to obscure from the public. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has essentially continued Mike Pompeo's reign of terror at the State Department and continued all of his policies, is doing this again. But it's worth noting that at least people are concerned about that, and it maybe seems that this report leaking was maybe to circumvent that before this information becomes classified. Right now it's just not public. If you go on the government accountability website, you can see the report there, you just can't access it. And so maybe getting out this information now is going to prevent it from being classified. But Connor, I'll let you go on and talk about what's happening with the Iran talks now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we have, continuing the IAEA's sort of fear-mongering campaign here with respect to Iran and this latest string of statements and hyperboles and reports. We have this guy, David Albright, who's a former IAEA inspector, who is putting out more intentionally misleading claims. The latest is this guy's saying that Iran's breakout time is now 0. And I was reading about this on Times of Israel, and they describe the outlet that he's speaking to as London-based Iran International, which they say is an Iranian opposition outlet. And you'll see them cited often in Times of Israel and some of these Israeli media reports. But they say that basically, he says that they also have enough high-enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. Now, this is, of course, an escalation beyond the usual sort of weeks away rhetoric, but it's still just as untrue. Albright admits he doesn't know how long it'll take for Iran to make weapons if they attempted to. He says it's a crude explosive could be produced in several months, less than 6 months. And he further conceded that if Tehran wants to build a like a warhead for a ballistic missile, that could take as much as 2 years before they're able to do that. But of course, the now 0 line is what makes all the headlines, by design. And and then I have another report here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com about how Naftali Bennett told the IAEA that Israel has a right to act against Iran's nuclear program. This is, this is starting to get a little bit almost too hypocritical. It's becoming farce at this point, because, we talked last week, and the Iranians have said recently that they see sort of Israel's hand behind some of these latest actions of the IAEA. And so that might sound to people like, oh, come on, really, is this just Iran being hyperbolic or whatever? But then, stuff like this happens, and it's almost like they're trolling. So last Friday, Bennett meets with Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, who is constantly being antagonistic with Iran about these undeclared sites. And even though Iran handed in all these, documents explaining the situation, the U.S. wants to continue making this an issue, so the IAEA continues to make this an issue. And so so now he meets with Naftali Bennett in what Bennett has referred to as a snap visit, which is just hilarious to me because they call them snap inspections, and that the IAEA makes on Iran. But of course, the IAEA does not inspect Israeli nuclear sites, so I don't know what they're talking. It's almost like he said that just to be flippant about it. But anyway, so they meet together and they put out these statements that are all about Iran, both Bennett and Grassi. So Bennett's office says that on Twitter, they say that Tel Aviv prefers a diplomatic solution to resolve the issue of Iran producing nuclear weapons, but we reserve the right to act in self-defense and action against Iran to block its nuclear program. Then Grassi, again, continuing with this profound hypocrisy, puts out a statement saying after the Bennett meeting, extolling and stressing the importance of IAEA safeguards and the Non-Proliferation Treaty for global peace and security. And then, of course, this is on the heels of all these latest, provocations by the IAEA, who seem to be at this point acting on behalf of the Americans and the Israelis. And this line about the Non-Proliferation Treaty got a lot of response on social media and elsewhere, just because it's so flagrant. Israel with their somewhere between 90 and 200 or 300 nuclear weapons. They've never their Dimona nuclear facility that's never been inspected by the IAEA. This has been going on since the 60s. Qatar has put out demands before for the IAEA to inspect Israeli nuclear sites. They're the only state in the Middle East that isn't a part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, et cetera, and nothing ever gets done. The fact that Grassi is doing this is a major provocation and shows that, the claims that Iran has put out that the agency seems to be lacking in impartiality and acting on a political basis rather than a technical basis seems to appear to be more and more true by the day. So, all right, now this is all kind of this. Here's the next story is about an Iranian aerospace engineer who died at a dinner party from food poisoning, what appears to be a food poisoning, but just because of the mysterious circumstances and his role in the drone and missile programs in Iran, it's led to some speculation that this could possibly be yet another Israeli assassination that has been carried out. And so I'll just say, Jason Ditz has a report here at antiwar.com laying out the essentials here. And he says, and what turns out to be he says, let's see. So his name is Dr. Ayub Entazari. He's an aerospace engineer who died on May 31st. Reportedly, he worked on the missile and drone programs and was found dead after going to a dinner party. But there's subsequent reports have come out that said that his relatives suspect that he was killed intentionally. There's other, so far as I can see, unconfirmed reports that the host of the party has actually fled the country. The Iranian media is downplaying the hype, suggesting that he was more or less an ordinary employee and unlikely to be a high-value target of any kind of assassination scheme or something. But the Israeli media by contrast, is embracing the narrative, reporting that Israel is now expanding regional travel warnings in anticipation of Iranian retaliation. So sort of implicitly hinting at an Israeli role in the death of the Dr. Entazari. All right, now the IAEA has begun its week-long meeting this week. Its quarterly Board of Governors meeting with 35 members. And they have Grassi started everything off by complaining about Iran, saying that their evidence and documents that they presented on the three undeclared sites that have these so-called, what we keep talking about is the traces of this unprocessed uranium particles that were found years ago that apparently date back decades, that Iran has, put these documents forward. He's saying that it's just not their explanations and their documents are not credible. And he says they're not complying with monitoring expectations. Now, the monitoring agreements expired long ago. There are no plans for new agreements until a return to the JCPOA is reached, and that's been true for a while. and there have been agreements that have been put in place before, but these cameras were there, they were taking the footage, but it wasn't going to be transferred over anyway until the U.S. returned to the deal. Now, Grassi was echoing Israeli propaganda as early as the first day of this meeting about Iran being only weeks away from a, quote, significant quantity of enriched uranium. And though he grants this, quote, does not mean having a bomb, Grassi is playing politics and fear-mongering. The U.S. and France are pushing the IAEA to rebuke and condemn Iran over their supposed non-cooperation or lack of, their insufficient cooperation on the issue of the undeclared sites. Grassi is expected to play ball, and he's continuing to issue a plethora of anti-Iran statements. The issue of the undeclared sites will remain the primary unresolved issue as far as the IAEA is concerned, in the same way that for a while now the IRGC FTO blacklist issue has been the main problem between the U.S. and Iran in terms of the diplomacy. But these sites, of course, the undeclared sites, were, quote, uncovered by Israeli spying, and Tel Aviv, of course, lobbies the U.S. heavily on this issue, and Israel is pushing the IAEA to ensure Iran is threatened and warned that they will, quote, pay a heavy price for their defiant nuclear policy. This is another statement Bennett put out in relation to the meeting with Grassi. So it's just, continuing to be. He, by the way, made that statement standing alongside El Hulada, who runs the U.S.-Iran working group with Jake Sullivan. So there's some notable political implications of all of this. Now, the U.S. is, of course, blaming Iran for the stall in the talks, which, of course, we know is ridiculous. But they put out a statement to the IAEA Board of Governors meeting. This is a report from Jason Ditz. U.S. blames Iran's demand for sanctions relief for nuclear talks failing. And if you go to the article in Reuters, they have the full statement. They say, this is so ridiculous, but they go, what we need is a willing partner in Iran. In particular, Iran would need to drop demands for sanctions lifting that clearly go beyond the JCPOA and that are now preventing us from concluding a deal. Well, again, not to belabor the point, but they're supposed to rescind the entire maximum pressure campaign. Is that or is that not entirely related to the JCPOA? Of course, there's a range of sanctions, human rights, the nuclear program, the sanctions to do with terrorism. But the maximum pressure campaign is what was to be rolled back. That was what was agreed on in these negotiations that have been carried out in Vienna since April, particularly since Grassi came into office and the Iranians came in with a stronger hand. Somewhat unexpectedly, because people thought that, these hardliners or whatever, they wouldn't be as good in negotiations as the moderates. Turns out the complete opposite, I think, is true. Doesn't mean that the U.S. and Iran are not going to sabotage the talks anyway, even if Iran is being forthright and is willing to do what it takes on their part to return to the deal. The Americans do not appear to be willing to reciprocate. And just as an example, this thing about the IRGC, of course it's related to the JCPOA. That sanction did not exist, or they were not even on that list until 2019. This was part of people, like the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. This is what they were looking for. They call it the sanctions wall. This is designed to prevent, explicitly, to prevent a successor from Donald Trump from ever returning to the JCPOA, because they know, and I guess they could count on the hawkish Democrats, largely because, the Republicans are never going to support the JCPOA or any kind of diplomacy or rollback intentions with Iran. The Democrats, that's been the worst part of this in some sense, has been their willingness to go along with this narrative and go, oh my God, you can't. The IRGC, they're the worst people in the world. You can't take them off the foreign terrorist organization blacklist, even if it means returning to the JCPOA. So, it's a horrible policy, but seems to be whoever designed it. They do seem to understand American politics very well. Now, the U.S. and the E3 submitted an anti-Iran resolution to the IAEA board on day 2 of the Board of Governors meeting this week. So they put forward their draft resolution. It censures and condemns Iran. It urges the IAEA to do that. And the resolution takes aim at the undeclared sites issue, again, echoing IAEA complaints about Iran's supposed lack of cooperation and, so-called questions that are left unanswered. Even after Iran turned over what they say were all the documents on the sites, of course, the U.S. Is pushing this issue. The Europeans are falling in line. There's an interesting piece about this that I'll get to in a little bit in Responsible Statecraft today about different reasons why the Europeans got behind this measure, which might differ strongly from why the U.S. And Israel support this. This draft resolution. But nevertheless, they do seem to be unified here. The Russians and the Chinese opposed it. Now, Iran's nuclear chief, Mohammed responded by questioning the IAEA's impartiality and said they need to put a stop to, quote, infiltration by Iran's enemies in its operations. He says, how is it possible? Confidential reports of an international organization are published in the media before the official recipients read them, referencing regular leaking of IAEA reports on Iran's nuclear program to Western media. Islami says Iran provided accurate answers on the 3 sites, but the IAEA lacks the will to declare Iran's answers convincing. He adds the probes are based on fake documents and accounts, referencing previous Israeli forgeries and some of these latest documents that we talked about last week that Israel has presented. He says these probes are based on fake documents and accounts provided by Iran's enemies, led by Tel Aviv, and that Tehran voluntarily cooperated with the IAEA, although now they see that there's really no point in that. He notes the discriminatory focus of the IAEA. He points out that Iran accounts for a small share of global nuclear activities, but undergoes a quarter of all agency monitoring activity, amounting to hundreds of inspections per year. Islami took aim at Grassi's trip to Israel, asking how many inspections is the agency doing in that country? Is it even allowed to make an inspection? He noted Bennett's threats to Iran during the meeting and said, this is the culture that's dominant now. These interferences show a clear movement against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, there was talk, and I'll get into this here in a little bit, but there was talk about potentially taking this issue to the UN Security Council. Although from what I've been reading, there is a reluctance here on the various parties. Obviously, Russia and China are going to veto it, but they think it would just cause more escalation. But I don't think, I don't think that it's ultimately going to matter because Russia and China, their veto on that is virtually guaranteed. So it would just be an extension of this fight that the Americans and the Europeans are picking right now. Now, Israel doesn't think the resolution is strong enough, of course. They think it needs to go further. Now, let's see. The IAEA voted to criticize Iran on the uranium traces. This is from Jason Ditz, again at antiwar.com today. On day 3, the board passed the U.S. E3 anti-Iran resolution. The resolution expresses profound concern at Iran's lack of a sufficient explanation. It's not clear what kind of enforcement power this has beyond just escalating tensions with Tehran. Even if it's ultimately taken to the Security Council, as I said, it won't be able to be enforced because Russia and China will block it. The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran announced that they have turned off the online enrichment monitor and the flow meter system of the IAEA at an unidentified site. I suspect we'll get more and more details about what actually went down here, what cameras were dismantled where. But all disconnected monitoring systems had been installed voluntarily beyond the framework of the IAEA Safeguards Agreement. The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said that more than 80% of existing IAEA cameras are covered by the Safeguards Agreement. They're operational and they will remain in place. Without a monitoring agreement in place, as I noted earlier, Iran wasn't obliged to keep the cameras there, and they said it was a goodwill gesture to have done so in the first place. So this will, I suspect this will be overhyped to the nth degree here, especially in coming days. But since there was no agreement for the IEA to get access to the footage, in practice, this will mean very little. The good news, based on all that I can pull out of this, I think, trying to be optimistic, is that Iran seems to be committing to remaining in the non-proliferation treaty, at least for right now. Now, if Israel starts attacking Iran, or if they do carry out more assassinations, or more sabotage attacks and covert attacks on the nuclear program, then it's possible that that could change. But as per usual, I think the Iranians are remaining relatively, in this dynamic, measured and calculated, and they don't seem to be allowing themselves to be provoked. As usual, the dismantling the cameras or increasing uranium enrichment or building further, more and more advanced centrifuges, all these different things, people act like, oh my God, but these are nonviolent retaliatory measures to people who are aggressing against them in acts of war, from the sanctions campaign, the maximum pressure campaign, to the Israeli attacks, the assassinations, the killing of scientists and military figures, as well as the U.S. doing the same thing, especially with the high-profile Soleimani assassination. And there's more and more reports coming out about just how economically devastated Iran is. Of course, the Americans are getting what they want. There's food riots in the country. More than half the country lives below the poverty line. Inflation has gotten worse and worse in the last several years. People's income per capita keeps going down, and people are having a hard time getting, meat, from poultry to red meat, and the prices of bread and rice keep going up. Wheat prices have skyrocketed. And of course, with the war in Ukraine and the sanctions blitz and all of this, all the economic fallout of that, and beyond what all the mismanagement of the Americans and its effect on the global economy, we're seeing inflation and food crises everywhere. But of course, countries like Iran are affected even worse because of the pre-existing American sanctions campaign, because we're at economic war with the people of Iran, mostly so that CENTCOM can get more money and more resources and funds, and so that Israel has an excuse for getting more and more billions of dollars on top of their guaranteed $3.8 billion every year from the American taxpayer, who is struggling as well. So I don't know where this is all going to go, but I do think that's pretty obvious at this point that we're probably not going to return to the deal. The IAEA is, for whatever reason, although they do seem to make this their main issue, and just the fact that they are consorting with Israel in this way, it's very in your face. It would be laughable if this didn't threaten to start a major conflict here at some point, because they're underwriting all of Israel's, their attacks. I mean, it took months for Iran to get them to actually condemn, and really they just did it once so that Iran would agree to, reinstall those cameras that were destroyed and that the IAEA had in an Israeli drone strike on their site in Karaj last June. But again, yeah, it's like pulling teeth to get the IAEA to say anything, even when it comes to Israel destroying their equipment in Iran. And so this is just, the hypocrisy is, it's insane. And the Americans are clearly readying a international PR campaign to justify basically Biden carrying out Trump's policy to its logical extent. I don't believe that they really did. Maybe they did think that they could extract concessions at the end of the day on the missile program and on Iran's support for their allies in the region and their partners. I don't know why they would think that, because it's so critical to their national security. Those are red lines, so to speak. So regardless, I don't think Iran was going to just subordinate itself to the U.S. and Israel. And at the if you look at this piece I was referring to earlier from Responsible Statecraft, there is a good argument to be made that the Europeans are making a mistake here because their intentions seem to be quite different. We've discussed previously how Joseph Borrell and the EU, Enrique Mora, who is the nuclear negotiator, the broker of the talks in Vienna, and Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, have noted that the Europeans, in the past, they had been horrible on this issue. This is me editorializing briefly, but they had basically been acting as vassals of the United States. But ever since on the Iran issue and just reciting all of their rhetoric, and it was really embarrassing, and we covered that. But with at the advent of the war in Ukraine, since then, the situation has changed, and the Europeans do have a pronounced interest in increasing their energy security and diversifying their, where they can import oil and gas. So returning the U.S. to the JCPOA actually became much more of a priority, a sincere priority, than it had been previously. And so Eldar Memdov writes a great piece here at Responsible Statecraft where he talks about how the Europeans seem to, when they put out these statements, their support for this draft resolution has the intent, at least they think, it will help to get Iran to come back to the table, make some necessary concessions. I guess they think they need to cooperate further with Iran. They probably buy into a lot of these IAEA statements about how the documents are insufficient, et cetera. But they are doing it ultimately because they think they can use that as a way to get Iran and the U.S. back to the deal. Although the U.S. and Israel are pushing this policy and this resolution in this IAEA campaign, basically to use it as a propaganda effort to justify the U.S. Torpedoing of the deal. He also points out, he says, moreover, there is a growing irritation in the EU at the Biden administration's failure to reach the deal. Former senior European officials, such as former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and EU chief diplomat Javier Solana, have criticized Biden's passivity and warned of destabilizing consequences if the JCPOA is not restored. EU officials have lobbied Washington to find ways to lift the IRGC designation and scoff at what they see as the, quote, irrationality of the U.S. domestic politics when it comes to Iran. And that is the major issue right here. He also points out that EU investment in Iran is, of course, subject to the sanctions that were reimposed under the Trump administration. But what is, notable is he points out that there was a French energy giant called Total, who had invested 1 billion euros, committed 1 billion euros into the development of the South Pars, which is estimated to be the world's single largest gas field in Iran, but had to shelve those plans, of course, when Trump reimposed sanctions and pulled out of the deal. So if Trump hadn't done that, for all the complaints about how the EU is too reliant on Russian energy, that would have been diversified much more and much further, and would have progressed much further now than it is at this point. So again, just more and more unintended consequences and blowback, but I don't think the Americans are going to return to the deal. And I think ultimately the Europeans are just going to have to deal with whatever the U.S. intends to do here. And so it's just very, very unfortunate and more bad news at this point. And we'll see where it goes. But it does appear to me at this point that you almost have the U.S. and the U.S. and Israel and the IAEA working in concert. I don't even know if the Europeans actually do really believe that they can get the Iranians back to the table and all this. I think that's a misreading, obviously, of the situation. But if they do, I think they're in for a real shock to see what the results of all this are going to be.
All right, Connor, thank you for that breakdown. And yeah, I agree. I think they are in deep trouble with all this. Anyways, thanks for coming back on the show to do another, kind of wrap up on what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal here. The news just seems progressively worse. So thanks for bringing that, Connor. And we'll be back with another show probably on Iran next week. But I got another show coming up later in the week with Dave DeCamp. So everybody be sure to subscribe to the show because I know he is probably one of the favorite guests that come on this show. Anyways,
Certainly
Connor,
one of mine.
all right, let's do a guess who. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.